The high-pitched, incessant sound of a child crying echoed through the departure terminal, a sharp blade cutting through the cacophony of flight announcements and the dragging of suitcases. For Arthur, a businessman accustomed to orchestrating every detail of his life, that sound was a relentless hammer beating inside his skull. The crying of Maya, his 5-year-old daughter, was not a tantrum. It was a cry of pure agony, a wail that seemed to tear the fabric of reality. He felt the stares like needles on his skin, the impatient whispers, the silent judgment that condemned him. Every fiber of his body screamed to run away to silence it, but he was paralyzed, sinking into a sea of noise and shame. Arthur felt like a complete and utter fraud. In the boardroom, he was a titan, a man of firm decisions and results that spoke for themselves. But there, under the cold, impersonal lights of the airport, he was just the father of a girl he couldn't comfort, a stranger to his own daughter. Diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, received 2 years ago in a gray room that smelled of disinfectant, had fallen on him like a sentence. He loved Maya with an intensity that hurt, but he didn't understand her. Her silence was an abyss between them, a void he tried to fill with everything but what really mattered: acceptance. The doctors used jargon that distanced him: spectrum, sensory processing, behavioral therapies. For Arthur, it all boiled down to an overwhelming and suffocating feeling of failure. Sleepless nights became his routine. The blue light of his laptop illuminated his tired face at 3 a.m. as he desperately searched for answers. Cure for autism, alternative treatments, reversal of symptoms. He read obscure forums where parents shared conspiracy theories and dense scientific articles he could barely decipher, clinging to any shred of hope. He spent a fortune, the equivalent of a luxury car, on treatments that promised the world. Equine therapy, which was supposed to be calming, left Maya terrified of the animal's size and strong smell. The auditory integration sessions, in which she was forced to wear headphones for hours, resulted in even more violent crises at the end of the day, as if all the pent-up anguish exploded at once. Each failed attempt was a new crack in his problem-solver armor. He looked at himself in the mirror in the morning and saw a stranger, a man with deep dark circles under his eyes and a permanent, worry line on his forehead, who had forgotten how to smile. Where was the man who built an empire from scratch? He lost himself somewhere between a crisis over a t-shirt label and an occupational therapy report that used the word stagnant. He felt anger, a corrosive anger that poisoned him from within. Anger at the world for not understanding, for looking at his daughter with pity or irritation. Anger at the doctors for not having answers, for talking about management instead of cure. And, most excruciating of all, anger at himself for feeling so powerless, for sometimes in his darkest moments, wishing for a normal life with an intensity that filled him with shame. His love for Maya was his only anchor, but under the weight of judgment and exhaustion, it seemed to drag him to the bottom of an ocean of complete loneliness. The journey to that airport had been paved with the stones of false hope. Every piece of well-meaning advice turned out to be a new form of torture. The most bitter memory was of the revolutionary diet. His cousin Elena, with the unshakable certainty of those who observe from afar, swore that gluten and casein were the real villains. "You'll see, Arthur, in a month she'll be a different child." I read it on a California blog. What followed was hell on earth. Mealtimes, once a challenge, became a battlefield. Maya, with her already extremely selective palate, went on a hunger strike. Arthur and Isabel spent hours trying to create bland dishes, with strange flowers, which Maya refused with palpable distress. One night, after an hour of Maya crying uninterruptedly in front of a plate of rice noodles, Isabel broke down in tears in the kitchen. "We can't do this to her, Arthur. She's suffering." But he insisted, blinded by the promise of a cure. The result? A thinner girl, more exhausted parents, and no change except for an even greater aversion to eating. Then came Dr. Petrov, a Russian therapist with an elegant clinic in an upscale neighborhood and a seductive discourse on neurological reprogramming. He talked about awakening the dormant areas of Maya's brain through an intense regimen of repetitive exercises. During one session, Arthur watched through a two-way mirror. He saw his daughter being forced to fit pegs into a board for 20 minutes straight, while Dr. Petrov said in a cold voice, "We need to break the resistance." Arthur saw his daughter's little flame going out, her gaze becoming empty, apathetic, puer. Last straw was when the doctor suggested that the mother's excessive attachment could be slowing down the process. The veiled accusation against Isabel was the final offense. He paid for the session, left, and never returned. But the feeling of having been complicit in that cruelty haunted him. And then there were the friends. Ricardo, his golf buddy, said with a slap on his back, "Arthur, you're too soft. Kids test boundaries. In my day, a good spanking solved everything." He just smiled, an empty smile, while inside he felt like smashing his golf club into the nearest tree. Each suggestion was another shovel of dirt on his hopes, a reminder of how ignorant the world was about his reality. The most visceral conflict was not with strangers but within the walls of his own home, a sanctuary that had become a silent battlefield. His wife, Isabel, had an approach that he, in his arrogance, saw as passivity. While Arthur sought solutions, Isabel sought connection. The fights once rare became the dark soundtrack of their nights. One night the argument exploded. "I can't take it anymore, Arthur. I can't stand seeing you treat our daughter like a failed project," she shouted, her voice breaking. "You don't accept her for who she is. You're always trying to fix her," he retorted, his voice laden with frustration bordering on despair. "And you just accept it. You've given up. You want me to just sit back and watch her disappear into her own world? I'm fighting for her." "No," she cried. "You're fighting for yourself, for your image of what a father and daughter should be." The silence that followed was more painful than the shouting. School was another stage for humiliation. The meeting with the principal, Mrs. Schmidt, had been devastating. Sitting in a chair too small for him in the colorful but sterile room, he listened to the list of complaints. "She doesn't interact, Arthur. In music class, she sits in the corner covering her ears. It's disruptive." The word disruptive echoed. His 5-year-old daughter was a disturbance. With a false tone of empathy, the principal suggested that perhaps a school with more specialized support would be more appropriate. It was a euphemism for expulsion. The cruelest blow, however, came from an attempt at normality. Isabel organized a play date with a coworker and his son, a boy named Lucas. For 10 minutes, the children stood on opposite sides of the playroom. Then Lucas tried to hand Maya a toy car. She didn't react, focused on lining up her blocks. Lucas, without malice, said to his mother, "Mommy, she doesn't want to play. She's weird." Arthur felt the air go out of his lungs. Lucas's mother, embarrassed, tried to smooth things over, but the damage was done. The word weird hung in the air. He politely ended the visit, but inside he felt devastated. There were no villains, just an invisible wall of prejudice, a wall that crushed him. And it was there, at the lowest point, at the epicenter of his failure, that the turning point came. A skinny boy with messy hair and big colorful headphones approached him. He didn't look at Arthur. His gaze seemed to focus on a point just above his shoulder, but his attention was entirely on Maya. "Sir," he said in a soft, almost monotone voice, "can I play a song to stop your daughter from crying?" Arthur's first reaction was to growl internally. Another busybody. He was about to dismiss him with a rude gesture, but something stopped him. There was a serenity about the boy, an absence of judgment that disarmed him. He saw the boy take a small violin out of a worn Star Wars backpack. The wood was worn, but he held it with a sacred reverence. Without waiting for a response, the boy placed the violin on his chin. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if connecting to another world, and began to play. It wasn't a classical piece. It was a simple, almost minimalist lullaby, a sequence of soft, repetitive notes that rose and fell like calm breathing. The opening note hung in the air, pure and clear, cutting through the noise of the airport. And then the impossible happened. Maya's high-pitched cry faltered. It choked and stopped. Her little sobs still shook her body, but the cry of anguish was gone. Her eyes, previously squeezed shut in agony, opened and searched curiously for the source of that sound. For the first time, Arthur saw curiosity on his daughter's face instead of pain. The boy, whom Arthur would later discover was called Leo, continued playing, immersed in his music, swaying gently. The melody was an anchor in the midst of the sensory storm. It was order in the midst of chaos. Some nearby passengers, who had previously cast angry glances, stopped to watch. An elderly couple smiled. A young woman filmed discreetly with her cell phone, tears in her eyes. Arthur looked at Leo, then at his daughter, who now had her head resting on his shoulder, listening intently. For the first time in a long time, the chasm between them didn't seem so frightening. It just seemed silent. And in that silence, something new and fragile began to sprout. The song ended, but the silence that followed was not empty. It was a dense silence, full of meaning. Maya, still nestled in Arthur's lap, stretched her little hand toward Leo. Not a hug, not a word, just a small hand, fingers spread, floating in the air. For Arthur, it was as if the sun had risen in the middle of the night. Leo approached and touched Maya's fingertip with his. One touch, and Maya didn't pull away. She smiled, a discreet smile, almost imperceptible, but it lit up her face and Arthur's heart. That was worth more than all the therapy in the world. That scene became Arthur's new guiding light. He stopped looking for cures and started looking for victories, and he began to find them everywhere. He turned the floor of Maya's room into his connection lab. He discovered that the way she organized her dinosaurs, by size and color, wasn't an obsession. It was her way of finding order. He started sitting with her not to correct her, but to observe. One day he moved the Stegosaurus to the wrong place on purpose. Without saying a word, she took his hand and gently guided it to the correct spot. She was communicating. He just had to learn her language. The dinnertime war was over. He created the safe plate, with dividers so that textures wouldn't mix. The peace this brought to the table was a daily victory. He discovered that she loved the feeling of grass on her bare feet, so every evening they would go out into the garden, and he would take off his shoes too. They would stand there in silence, just feeling the earth. One night, as he was putting her to bed, he began to hum the melody Leo had played. Maya, who usually avoided eye contact, turned her face toward him and looked him in the eyes. It was a direct, deep gaze. It lasted 5 whole seconds. In those 5 seconds, Arthur felt a connection so strong that it took his breath away. There was no "I love you," but the message was perfectly received. He bought a small toy keyboard and discovered that she liked to press the same 3 notes over and over again. It wasn't noise, he understood. It was predictability. It was comfort. They were silent victories, built note by note, gesture by gesture. Sitting in his luxurious office with the city view at his feet, Arthur finally understood. For years, he had acted like the businessman he was. He identified a problem and sought a solution. He applied the cold logic of his business to his daughter's soul and failed spectacularly. He mentally revisited the scenes from his journey. Dr. Petrov's face, promising a reprogramming that sounded more like torture. Mrs. Schmidt's pitying look at school. His own harsh words to Isabel. He felt shame, but it was a shame that didn't paralyze him. It purified him. That boy at the airport, Leo, he didn't offer a magic solution. He offered something infinitely more valuable: translation. He didn't try to stop the crying with words or logic. He saw Maya's sensory overload and gifted her with harmonious order. He met her where she was, in her world of intense sensations, and gave her a safe sound to hold on to. The melody wasn't a cure, it was a bridge that Arthur, with all his intelligence and resources, never knew how to build. He understood that his greatest battle was not against autism. It was against his own ego, his arrogance, his fear. The fear of having a different child, the fear of judgment, the fear of his own incompetence as a father. He wanted to fix Maya because her condition exposed his own weaknesses. Accepting Maya as she was did not mean giving up. It meant the opposite. It meant loving her in her entirety, with her silence, her crises, her sensitivity, and her unique way of seeing the world. The transformation was not in Maya, it was in him. He stopped fighting the tide and learned to build a better boat, a boat that could sail in her waters. And in those waters, which had once seemed dark and threatening, he began to discover islands of beauty, peace, and a connection so deep that it transcended words. He realized that for years he had been shouting instructions from outside the water, when all he needed to do was jump in and learn to swim alongside her. Life did not become a fairy tale. Reality does not bow to epiphanies. There were still difficult days, A trip to the supermarket could still turn into a crisis because of the fluorescent lights. But the difference was Arthur. He now had the right tools, and they weren't in expensive clinics. They were inside him: patience, observation, humility, and a willingness to enter her world. Months later, it was Maya's 6th birthday. There was no noisy party with dozens of children. Instead, Arthur and Isabel organized a sensory celebration. They filled the room with silent helium balloons and amber fairy lights, which she loved. The cake had no candles to avoid the scare of fire and smoke. Arthur's main gift was in a large box. When Maya opened it, her eyes lit up. It was a small violin, just like Leo's. She didn't play it right away. First, she ran her fingers gently over the wood, feeling its texture. Then she smelled the varnish. Only then did she nestle it against her chin, in the awkward way that only a 6-year-old can. Arthur knelt beside her, took the bow with her, and guided it over the strings, producing a scratchy but real sound. Maya laughed, a genuine loud laugh that filled the room and her parents' hearts. At that moment, Isabel put her hand on Arthur's shoulder, and they exchanged a look that said it all. There was no more war between them, only partnership. They had learned to celebrate progress, not perfection. They had learned that Maya's silence was not absence, but a language of its own, full of nuances that they were finally learning to decipher. Happiness was not the absence of pain, but the overwhelming presence of connection. Arthur looked at his daughter, the girl with the violin, and no longer saw a diagnosis. He saw Maya, and that was more than enough. It was everything. Not all love speaks, but all true love listens. If this story touched you in any way, like it, comment with your experiences, and subscribe to the channel. Sometimes a story is the bridge someone needs to feel less alone. Someone, somewhere, may need to hear this. Today,